Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about Netflix's The Sandman. And I'm going to do a brief contrast and comparison to the comic book that the episode is based on, particularly this scene is based on, because I want to look at the scene in A Hope in Hell and the battle between Dream and Choronzon, or the, as it is in the Netflix adaptation, the battle between Dream and Lucifer. And I think this is really interesting in terms of getting to grips with how an adaptation can differ from the source material, can make changes to the source material, and still remain true to the source material in some way. And also how things that can change the emphasis, the tone, the style, or even the message of a scene can still remain in some way true to the essence of the narrative that it is based on. And the reason I picked this one out is there are some subtle differences, there's some very blatant differences, and some of which I think have quite practical explanations. And others, I think, are more thematic and reflect a change in tone or theme or style. And for the most part, there's one minor change and then some more significant changes. So let's start with the minor change. And the minor change is when Choronzon challenges Dream in the comic book, he creates this whole sort of vaudeville stage and nightclub act. And Dream is summoned up from the audience, and Dream is dressed very much as if he's been sitting in a 1930s nightclub. And obviously, in the Netflix adaptation, that's not what happens. It's much more formal, it's much more serious, it's much more grand than the sort of slightly campy, slightly funny, slightly silly, but with an underlying seriousness that is emphasized in the comic book. Here, it is played much straighter, much more in your face, much less ambiguous about the importance of this challenge. And a second sort of minor change is through the comic book sequence, Dream actually supplies commentary through internal monologue about what is happening, explaining things to the reader, explaining his reasoning, explaining what's going on, and commenting on things. That is entirely absent from the television production because it's much more externally focalized in the television adaptation. We have a camera looking at Dream. We're not getting his interiority. We're only getting what is being said, what he is seeing, what he is saying, how he is being viewed. We aren't getting his internal monologue. And that is a change. It is reliant on, it makes the story a lot more reliant upon how the actor can portray things. And also, one of the other changes is having another character interject to do something, which we have with Matthew the Raven interjecting in the battle to spur on and inspire and try to give confidence to Dream, something that is entirely absent in the comic book version. But if we think about this whole sequence, the first major change that anyone really notices, because I don't think the setting changing and that slight tonal shift is really that major, but the first major change is that instead of battling a Duke of Hell in the television adaptation, Dream is battling Lucifer. And there are some practical reasons for this, as well as I think some deeper reasons. And obviously the practical reason is they have cast Gwendoline Christie as Lucifer. There's been this whole thing where they have been talking and sparring and having a discussion. And therefore, why not make use of the character that has already been introduced instead of introducing a new demon now, have the quick battle and then get rid of that demon? Focus on the characters who are already there and that the audience are going to recognize and be invested in. So that's one reason, just a straightforward, practical, pragmatic reason. But secondly, this raises the stakes in the television version In the comic version, Dream is battling a duke, and Lucifer is looking on, is adjudicating, is the judge. And there is the implication, really, that Lucifer, this is for Lucifer's amusement. But here we have Lucifer being deeply invested in beating Dream, that this is a straight up, no holds barred fight between the ruler of hell and the ruler of the dream world. And this raises stakes perceptibly and obviously for the audience. We know how powerful Lucifer is. We have been told specifically by Dream when he was revealing this information by a expositionary dialogue to Matthew that Lucifer is in fact potentially the second most powerful being in all of existence. And that is who Dream is now being put up against. If Dream had been going up against the Duke, we would have thought it was a much fairer fight. But now we get a sense that Dream actually feels that he is potentially outmatched here. So it puts Dream in the position of underdog, elevates the threat level of this competition, and also implies that Lucifer has basically orchestrated this whole thing just so they could crush Dream. And crushing Dream is an interesting thing when we talk about literalized metaphors. So the change of who the antagonist is in this scene, I think, cleans up a lot of the interpretation and adds that resonance of two rulers essentially going to war through the old forms. And it adds that sense of an archaic challenge, an archaic duel, that there are formal aspects to it that must be adhered to, and yet at the same time gives us that sense of danger and that sense of threat. So I think all of that is wrapped up very neatly in the change of antagonist. So I think that is a really effective change that doesn't do any disservice to the comic book in any way and is actually doing something that the comic book did, but in sharper relief. Now, the next thing that kind of changes is there's actually a change to the sequence and what they assert as these different aspects of reality. In the comic book, direwolf is countered by hunter, is countered by horsefly, is countered by spider, is countered by snake, is countered by ox, is countered by anthrax, is countered by a world, a nova, a universe, anti-life, and then Dream ends on hope. And that is slightly different to what we get in the TV version. In the TV version, it starts much the same way. Direwolf, hunter, snake, bird of prey, butcher bacterium, which is another way of basically saying anthrax, a world, a nova, a universe, anti-life. Then we have Matthew interjecting, and then Dream returns with hope. So this is obviously a change of the sequence. Like, why change the sequence? It shortens the sequence slightly. The change of anthrax to butcher bacterium, I'm potentially assuming that it makes it either more palatable to an audience, I don't know, or makes it clear that it's a bacterium. The phrase butcher bacterium is obviously in the comic, but they forego using the term anthrax. But they have truncated the sequence and also have cleaned it up slightly. The idea of an ox defeating a snake is much less obvious than a bird of prey defeating a snake. But the removal of horsefly, spider, snake, ox, it's truncated slightly, it's sped it up slightly. But now, actually, butcher bacterium doesn't seem to work with bird of prey quite as well as it seemed to correspond to ox, which is an odd thing to point out because essentially it doesn't really matter. But it shortens it slightly, it makes it slightly punchier to get through the exchange. It still shows the transition from thinking of things that are going to kill the other thing to thinking of the transition to a world and the idea of being nurturing. So instead of attacking, not really defensive, but thinking of something that is difficult to defeat. So we still see that change, that turn in Dream's logic still present. And we still see then the getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, those of you familiar with Disney's The Sword and the Stone might remember a very similar contest between, is it Merlin? And I cannot remember the name of the witch, but they go through the whole shape changing thing. And it's essentially the same game. But this one obviously is much more serious. So, in terms of change from the graphic novel to the screen, makes it slightly shorter, makes it slightly punchier. It follows the line of logic, I think, in a slightly clearer way, because I don't think Ox defeating Snake is a natural connection an audience is going to make. And in terms of how it's visualized, while it's slightly more abstract in the comic, it is still pretty much these images appearing in the background, whereas we have a cut to these images sort of surrounding the combatants. So it's just a slightly different way of visualizing it. Now, here we get to the major change to the sequence that I am not sure that I particularly like, but I think I know why it's there, and I'll make a couple of suggestions. And that is when Lucifer uses anti-life, Dream falls to the ground and seems stuck, seems about to give up. And Matthew the Raven interjects. Patton Oswalt's voiced Matthew the Raven. And the Raven says, boss, hey boss, listen to me. You know what can survive the anti-life? You. Dreams don't effing die. Not if you believe in them. And I believe in that Dream of the Endless would never leave his Raven here alone in hell with Lucifer. And Matthew sort of seems to spur Dream on and give Dream the inspiration for the next line. And that's obviously not how it is in the comic. In the comic, Dream counters with Hope that he had led the demon into a trap, knowing that the demon was going to keep escalating and keep escalating. And this was the trap that Dream had laid. Here, it feels very much that he wasn't expecting anti-life. He then is inspired. So it makes Dream slightly more fallible, slightly less shrewd and cunning, but it also makes Dream more reliant on trusting those around him, on taking account of the people who serve him and paying attention to what they are saying. And that is something I think the series has focused slightly more on than the comic did, at least early on. The comic gradually builds to Dream paying more attention to the people around him, the people that serve him, thinking outside of himself. Because Dream in the early issues is very egocentric, is very preoccupied with what he is doing, his thoughts, his view on the world, and his judgment. But later on becomes, and let's not go into that. I don't want spoilers for the rest of the series of comics for people. But this instance of Matthew chiming in to support Dream, to encourage Dream, suggests that this is where the TV show is going at an earlier point than the comics did. And it's not that the comics don't eventually end up there, but I think this is an earlier step towards that. And that perhaps is why I slightly dislike this one line. And it's not that it is a bad line. It is not that it isn't an interesting choice. It's just, for me, it robbed Dream of that moment of victory because it seems to come essentially from Matthew rather than it being part of Dream's plan. And this all sort of comes down to the slightly new way that the TV show is portraying Dream's journey. So I would certainly say it's a very valid and interesting choice to be made in terms of adaptation, and I don't object to it in any way. But just I have that slight shade of I think it robs Dream slightly in this scene of his power and his command. Now, one of the sort of criticisms, I suppose, that people make about this whole sequence is why doesn't Lucifer just say despair? Despair defeats hope. Of course, despair is one of Dream's siblings, but more to the point, this is not about the fact that hope destroys anti life. This is Dream understanding who his opponent is. Because what is hell without the dream of heaven? What is hell without this hope that one day you will be free? And that is why, in this particular circumstance, neither Choronzon or Lucifer, regardless of which version of the battle we're looking at, can think of anything more powerful because their lives are ruled by, dominated by, and completely categorized by this hope. And I think that is something that obviously both the comic book version and the television version make sure to emphasize to the reader that, oh, what power do dreams have in hell? And it's the ultimate power, the dream of heaven. And I think that needed to be tied in because it's not a natural way to interpret the idea of hope at the end of that sequence. Because almost always when we see competitions like this, we argue with it and we go, why didn't they just say? And yet, this is because it is a battle being fought in hell. So it is a brilliant, absolutely brilliant piece of writing that Gaiman produced for the comic book and they have reproduced in the television show. And it is actually acted very, very well. Dream is very self contained. Lucifer is gloating and prideful, exactly the way that we think of this fallen angel. And so everything about it plays into this. Lucifer thinking they have the upper hand, Dream looking to be defeated as the weaker of the two parties, but ultimately triumphing. So ultimately, you can see how there are changes to this sequence. It has changed the tone and the presentation of how it was done in the comic book, but ultimately, that doesn't make a big difference. It changed the adversary. And that changes the threat level. It changes our interpretation of the scene. It changes how we feel about it. It changes the entire framing of it. And yet it still fits. And it's much more obvious then about the antagonism between Dream and Lucifer. We have a change to the sequencing, which streamlines it, makes it slightly more logical and easier to follow because how many different moves do you need in this game? And I think that makes a lot of sense. We have the interjection of a helper on behalf of Dream. And, that's the one I'm a little bit iffy on. And then we have going back basically to how it finishes in the comic book with Dream asserting that the dream of heaven is the very power that rules hell. So there's a lot that is the same. And these small tweaks, these tonal shifts, add to a slightly different narrative being told that is still very true to the original ethos of the text, even with these changes. So I hope that this has been an interesting discussion of how absolute fidelity to the surface level things is not important, that you can have changes of character and of scene and of language that is still being true to the ethos of something, that change is not necessarily bad, that the thrust and feeling and direction of the narrative can actually be completely interrupted and moved in a different direction, even if it is a slight sidestep. And that can still be, in some ways, very true to the original. And an acceleration of theme from the source into the television show is not necessarily a bad thing. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.